Recording.
Hey everyone,
This is Dylan.
and this is Maha.
We're the hosts of That Wasn't Too Hard, where we talk about process design, organizational improvement, and other fun-related topics. Today, we're talking about the Toyota Production System leadership principles, which are fancier than they sound. Maha's going to break it down for us, and I think there's a lot we can learn, each of us, in the lessons that will apply today.
That's actually for
You
sure.
ready to get?
Go ahead. I like that we never
Are you
sync,
ready
so
to
I'm
get
keeping
started,
this.
Maha?
Oh yeah, obviously,
Okay.
clearly.
Okay.
Thank you for finishing my sentences. There we go. But no, I'm definitely ready to go because it is simpler than a lot of people think, because it's pretty much based on respect and based on people.
And it works.
And it works. It still works, and it's something that Chrysler and all the big auto companies eventually adopted. And let me tell you a story, Dylan. You see,
I'm ready.
once upon a time, there was a senior executive from the United States that got hired by Toyota, and this person actually knew about the system, even implemented the system in the company that they previously used to work for, which is a US automaker. But then he got hired by Toyota, and he thought that his onboarding was going to be smooth. He thought he knew everything about the system, and apparently he didn't. You want to know why?
Please tell.
His idea about how to manage people is completely and utterly, well, different. And
sure.
Toyota actually put him through a 3-week or 3 months intensive onboarding, where the focus was on actually walking around the plant, actually saying that you're not managing people, you're coaching people on change, and that they are the instigators of change, and that your only job is to encourage them to experiment and find what's right for them. And from there, you move on to basically the big part, which is, again, change on the site is not really up to you. It's up to the people themselves, or it's up to the workers. The workers know best. How does that sound for a lot of companies around the world?
Yeah, that sounds pretty radical. I've heard of this. I even saw a little bit of it, but it is definitely unintuitive. Where do you feel like this approach got its start?
I would usually say the opposite, where the opposite approach got its start was pretty much from the Industrial Revolution, and how we actually measure and the input and output of people. Because on one hand, when it comes to us supervising and managing each and every step of the process, and us thinking of people as part of the mechanic, or kind of part of the big machine that is going to produce profit for us, I would say started from there. And when you look at even how economists eventually measured input and output, and the economic indicators such as GDP, et cetera, that drove it too, it all comes from the idea that a person's output can be exactly measured through the input that they're putting in, and which is absolutely crazy, because, we can't say, for example, that, let's say, a person could produce 45 widgets a minute. That's not really how things work, but they did, and they measured them for a while. But in reality, too, here is that we kind of have moved way past that economy right now. We moved into a knowledge economy, right? So we're now at a stage where we're a knowledge-based economy. Some economists would even argue that we're in a service-based economy, or an experience-based economy right now. But then the output is what exactly? What do you think is the employee's output right now, Dylan? Is whether on a plant site or even beyond?
Sure. I mean, coming from a knowledge work industry myself, I would say the output of my work is usually thought, carefully written down somehow, how does that land?
I would argue back and say, what is thought? I mean, I'm not only just going philosophical here, but even when you think about how to actually measure thought, how to measure that output is really interesting.
Right.
So,
I mean, in my industry, we usually say like lines of code per day or something like that, or releases per week or month.
so how about this? I'm gonna take your answer, flip it back, and say, how is that different than someone producing widgets back in the day?
I know.
Nothing. It's not.
Really is. And the goofiest thing is like, I totally buy that these metrics of output are very loosely at best tied to value, because who's to say that the lines of code or the releases are helping?
Yeah, no, this is the thing. So, and who would say that those lines of codes or those lines of code that never made it to the release are not valuable? And I'm going to give you, oh, go ahead. Sorry. Too much caffeine.
Well, I mean, yes, like these are bad KPIs, bad performance metrics, but you know what?
What?
I think I'm kind of spoiled, and I think it could be worse. Because you know what's a worse metric of output is looking busy, like your boss walking behind you because you're in the office. I feel like we've all had this conversation about remote work after COVID, and a lot of bosses are now saying are being challenged to with the idea that if their employees, their old management style was very, very poorly connected to output, where they said, do you look busy all the time? And I'm going to try to keep you looking busy, as opposed to what value or what did you get done this week?
Good job. That's a great book. I mean, God rest his soul. He just recently passed, actually, about a year ago. But that was an excellent book by an anthropologist looking at how people are keeping themselves busy and how a lot of the work that we're doing ends up having no purpose, having no value. And it's actually just to look busy. It really is in a lot of cases. So you're not off the ball from that. Really recommend our listeners, and including yourself, actually, Dylan, to read that book. It's an excellent book. He was an excellent guy. Yeah,
I will. It reminds me a little bit. I actually have my most read blog post on Salty on Security is about the fifth kind of work, performative work, which is not work that is like delivering value to a customer or improving a process or improving the value of what you deliver, like or unplanned work of fighting fires, but just work to look valuable. You're performing. And someone.
So 90% of the consulting industry.
Right. Well, yeah, and framing your work and showing how awesome you are, and
using tools, lots of shiny tools, and lots of acronyms, etc. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just going to touch on that. I'm going to touch on it because I was stung badly by it eventually, but that's another thing too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this topic is deeply divisive, because when you go to management, people who have been executives for a while, they'll say, well, that's just the way the world is.
And they want that.
When you talk to people who have been engineers or unit process owners, or like foremen for manufacturing, they get real angry about performative work.
And that's interesting, because if you circle that all back to the element of respect, right?
Oh yeah.
What are we respecting? Are we respecting people who give us ideas and who give us this output, or are we respecting then the hustle, for example, and the bustle, and just looking like you're busy? How do we actually indicate respect in this case? How do we respect, let's say, the employee, in this case? How are we measuring respect? Is that something that has a cultural element to it too? I mean, a lot of business in the end is kind of based on kind of American centrism, if I want to even call it that, where looks do matter, and where a lot of how you present things does matter. Being an extroverted salesperson matters. Showing them in shiny things does matter. So maybe that's a little bit of kind of the separation there too.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, Maha. I really like that you brought it back to respect. And it reminds me, it's probably about time that we just explain to our listeners exactly what those Toyota production system, the Toyota way leadership principles are. Can you give us a summary of them and why we should care?
So when it comes to the Toyota principles, there are about 14 principles that belong to two main pillars. We've been discussing the red pillar for quite a while, which specifically kind of addresses challenges, addresses Kaizen, and addresses all these other tools that focus on the process improvement aspect. The other pillar, which loosely in English translates to respect for people, but could also be even translated as value for humanity, or valuing what it is to be human, focuses on the respect of your employees and everyone actually that touches upon your process, including your suppliers and your intermediaries as well. From there, we can actually talk about how this pillar, which funny enough is such an important pillar for the Toyota production system, is even sometimes overlooked by a lot of Western societies because of the loose translation of respect for people.
Yeah, I can see how that might be the case. It would mean a deep cultural change in the way people treat each other.
And exactly, because if we do, oh, go ahead.
So tell us, how would you implement a respect for people? Like say you wanted to go full bore, what would it look like? What does respect for people or humankind look like? It sounds very fuzzy wuzzy.
It is.
Hippity dippity.
It is,
Not real business value. Sell us on it.
I'm going to sell you on it because I'm going to bring it back to indicators, and I'm going to bring it back to how we see output. Because if you think about it, the way a lot of companies, not just in the West, but a lot of companies in a lot of different places, see output is a finished product that they're going to get from their supplier, or as a finished product that they're going to get from something else. They miss out on the experience, they miss out on the interaction, and they miss out on what I would even call strategic partnership building as well. Strategic partnership building is something that's been coming up over and over and over again, as something that is a key part of the supplier versus company sort of relationship. And Dylan, let me ask you a question. What do you think is strategic partnership really about?
I think of so many things, but mostly I think of corporate buzzwords.
If I want to simplify it, it's actually about instead of trying to squeeze your supplier to get things as cheaply as possible from them, for example, services and products, it's about a partnership, and there's an exchange that happens. So to actually, if you think about it, it's more fuzzy, but it's also very logical and very humane relationship that you have. So instead of again, pressuring your supplier or selecting a supplier based on principles of what is cheaper and what is quicker and faster, it's about harnessing a relationship, and it's about building a relationship based on respect, interestingly enough, which goes back to the original principles of Toyota. Yeah. This is, and it matters. Go ahead.
It just strikes me as so antithetical to the way many businesses work today, with outsourcing being a way to treat a big part of your workforce as subhuman, or you can kind of put it out of sight and out of mind, how poorly they live. Like, I think of Cognizant and their many call center workers that do fairly good work for very cheap, very good rates. And
burnouts.
Yeah, or TCS often has become the underpinning of like support for that old AS400 COBOL app that you've got running in the closet. And those guys have the best attitudes, but the different bill rates make you disrespect them and devalue their worth, because it just doesn't cost as much to waste their time as it does to waste
people.
Yeah, the time of someone onshore. And I think, or you can even generalize this to outsourcing your custodial work. Like, you're gonna fire your custodial staff and then replace them with a managed service. Well, you do that so you don't have to pay them benefits anymore.
And that's kind of biting people in the butt, really, and biting a lot of businesses in the butt. I mean, I'm going to touch on kind of the issue that outsourcing has been having on services and on things such as innovation, even in a lot of economies. But let's go back to something that is really fundamentally wrong with the service industry right now. When you think about it, the high turnover in these service industries, where I'm just going to take a person, burn it out, and just replace it with another person. And a lot of industries, by the way, and a lot of even outsourcing companies are more than okay with not addressing the burnout rate or not addressing the high turnover, while some have managed to realize that the turnover is an issue, and that if you really want to kind of build those relationships up with the people that you're outsourcing for, you better keep some of the same staff. You better keep the knowledge, because they're discovering again that when staff leave, tacit knowledge leaves with them too. And that relationships and those built relationships should be measured as an output of success, or as an output of a service that you're providing. And I think that's what Toyota figured out a long time ago, is that aspect of relationships building, that aspect of being human, and that aspect of respect has a lot of value that you just, sometimes it's really hard to measure, but sometimes could make or break a society, or could make or break a business. What do you think about that, Dylan, too?
Yeah, it seems like, I'm gonna paraphrase you a little bit. It sounds like you're saying that our decision to outsource work is often a bad deal. It's a bad financial decision, and the driver of that bad financial decision is bad metrics. We're focusing on an incomplete picture of value.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I probably have preached to the choir more than once now about how bad ways of measuring things have driven us to forget about basic things. And I really do think about that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was talking to someone last week about this podcast, and it hit me. That's the whole point of this podcast, is helping give ideas about better ways of thinking about and measuring success. I think there's a lot of good practices here.
Yes.
And the messages in today's episode are going to be real challenging for a lot of hard-bitten business people with a real tight eye on CapEx and OpEx and
economists.
Yeah, right. And economists. But but there is value. I'm struggling, but I think I'm getting there. Okay, so tell me more about the autonomy part. You mentioned autonomy, and how does that differ from respect, and why is that important as well?
I can even argue that they go hand in hand, in all honesty, too, right? If we want to respect someone who's an adult, for example, we respect the adult by saying you're an adult, you can make your own decisions. But when you think about how we apply this idea of they're an adult, they own up to their own actions into the workforce, there's a little bit of a gap on that application, because we see management as somehow policing or somehow managing the actions of other people to ensure that their production is in line with the organization. I think what Toyota figured out a while ago is that actually, for us to respect people, we need to respect their autonomy as adults, and we need to respect that they know that they're going to deliver the best for the organization. It's our job as leaders to coach them and to show them what sort of output would be valuable for an organization. And this is what Toyota touched on. And I think this is something that, funny enough, I keep forgetting his name, but Frédéric Laroux actually touched on as well in his book, Reinventing Organizations, which is a pretty new book compared to Toyota's production system. And in his book, he argues that actually that aspect of autonomy and that aspect of empowering your employees to do what's best for the organization is going to be the future of business. It is not you sitting on a plant site and trying to police the production that someone might actually give. It's actually coaching them and giving them room to experiment, giving them room to know what's right for the business and why, and just giving them room to do. I don't know if that touches on kind of the relationship between autonomy and respect, but I hope it does. Is there anything? Yeah.
Well, I got another one. So very frequently in American business, there's this tiered approach of influence. Within the business, you have the doers. Well, at the very bottom is vendors, right? Suppliers. They're like, the customer is always right. And so a supplier will never push back. And then above them are these doers, right? The people who pull a crank or assemble a thing, or they follow the instructions.
Yes.
And then above them are the thinkers, and the thinkers figure out what the doers should do. And above the thinkers, there are the consultants, and the consultants tell the thinkers how to think. Or maybe just that the thinkers are right about how they're thinking. How do you feel this model of running this paradigm of tiers would line up with how Toyota would recommend you do things?
Let me argue this one too, and I think I have a lot of grievances with that, and it's kind of it's true, because I have a lot of grievances with it and its origin, even because its origin is imperialistic. Its origin is you got the king, you got the consultants, you got the jesters, and I was probably one of the jesters. You got basically the who are the people that used to die a lot because they were working their butts off? Peasants. Yes, peasants. Yes, you got the peasants, and then under the peasants you got basically everyone else, which funny enough technically would be the suppliers. We haven't really, I mean, for a country, for example, that has fought against imperialism and dumped tea into to make a gigantic teapot, it still follows an imperialistic system, tiered system of how work should be and how the command line actually looks like as well. We claim in 2020 plus that we've kind of moved away from these systems. Right now, we're all working remote. You got these fully remote companies as well, that preach to the choir about autonomy and preach to the choir about, again, how people should work together. But in reality, if the communication line is top to bottom, never bottom to top, and there is no sort of way to encourage it to even go bottom to top feedback, then your system is never going to really work, or never going to reach this sort of teal level, if that makes sense too, which is some of the arguments, some of the tealers, if I want to even call them that, argue sometimes. They say that organizations are at orange, which is kind of the color schema that LaRue used, and that they would never reach that kind of autonomy because, again, they're not giving employees the chance to be self-sufficient, and they're not really giving the employees the psychological safety, which was what we talked about even last time, for them to reach that level too. So my short answer from my long rant about the history of how that is and why it's still a problem is that unless you're getting feedback from your suppliers on how to do things better, i.e., that's where the strategic partnership thing is, unless you're getting feedback from your actual doers, the guys that are on site, the guys that are actually doing the work, the guys that have their hands soiled with your business, basically, all the way up to the leadership, and that's not going to happen. We discussed in the previous episode something really interesting too, which is, you cannot do Kaizen. You cannot do any of that stuff unless you're a leader that is on the plant side doing those local inspections, right?
Yeah.
Something that the Toyota principles also, interestingly enough, preached.
You just clarified something that I hadn't made this connection for before, but so in Deming's world and in the statistical process control and the design of experience and this like deep math side of Lean Six Sigma, there's this phrase, listen to your process. And it's very hippy dippy and like, but see what is actually happening and like let your process talk to you. And you are advocating, maybe via Toyota, to let your the people who are doing the work
Peasants
talk to you. They should be driving the insights.
That's what really Toyota does, because those are the people who usually drive the insights. Those are the people you allow to experiment. So when you do a change, on a Toyota production site, for example, you might be seeing the change, but actually you're allowing the employee to experiment with the change. And if the change has been accepted by the employee and then accepted, by the managers of that plant site, that's when the change kicks in. This is something, again, go ahead.
Back to like your hard-bitten business manager, if you're experimenting with business strategies, boy, that's a lot cheaper just having a line worker do it than engaging all sorts of thinkers, right?
A problem with change management, which is what I wanted to touch on too.
Sure.
Because we see change management as, this is the best solution, apply the solution, basically make or break the solution and then leave, versus saying, for example, well, this worked for this one individual. So let me give you kind of let me air my grievances, since I've been doing that all day. But airing my grievances on change management is that on an organizational level, or on a kind of in a knowledge-based economy, has been that we will apply this change to this one department. We're going to test it on this one department. If it succeeds, we roll it out on everyone else. I hate that. I despise that. From an HR, I always tell people, from an HR perspective, that's idiotic. If I apply change on a sales organization, that doesn't mean that the same change will work on an IT organization or anything else. So this is actually, interestingly enough, what Toyota does. It decentralizes change and makes it the piece of respect and autonomy that an employee will have on that single process that they're doing. And if it works for everyone else, then everyone else is going to have that change for that one thing. If it's about changing a bog or changing something, or like adding a seat, for example, in a car, it's going to be for that plant site. It's going to be for that sort of car model. It's going to be for that sort of chair. And it focuses then on the change being effective for that process. It's about respecting people within even that process and even in that space, and respecting their knowledge, really. But yes, that's my rant.
So, Maha, you just said something that probably scares a lot of security professionals, because the whole idea of a security team is that most of the people in the organization are bad at it and need to be governed.
Sounds like you're trying to be a papa.
Yeah, or a cop, right? Yeah. And I think this is part of the reason that security teams are not well liked, because they're trying to like tell other people how to do stuff, and frequently they're wrong, because they might be right about some of the security things, but telling somebody else how to structure their data or their APIs or something, they have already put more thought into it than you have. And I want to get your thoughts. I met this guy once, and this guy was an architect. And architect is a newfangled HR term for the previous role of business analyst, which is someone who can have both the idea of how someone's going to use a piece of tech and also how to build the tech.
Yep.
And he was an architect, and he said, well, what we're doing is architecting the whole organization. And these people need to be controlled. We need to prevent them from doing any of the wrong things. And so we need to build this enterprise architecture, this enterprise governance. Foolproof, right? And I was just trying to solve a little problem, and like we were talking, and I just smiled and nodded. And I think that perspective, I mean, there's some value there. Like sometimes people really don't know about the right way to solve a particular problem.
How are you going to tell them about it? That's a big, for me, that's a big part. Am I going to police them, or am I going to have a discussion about it?
Right. So how do you think Toyota would recommend kind of cajoling lots of people doing lots of small changes into following good patterns that in areas that they might not be expert in? Like another example might be, hey, we get a heck of a discount if y'all use the same tool for
everything. Excel.
Yeah, like if we have the same 403 steel supplier, man, we can for all the plants we can negotiate a hefty discount. But if the low level people are making those decisions about how to improve, how do you balance those two competing priorities?
This is actually something I think a lot of businesses do think about sometimes when they negotiate these large kind of multinational deals. Is that what is the upside for us? Cost. What is the downside for us? Maybe it's customization, usability, or applicability across their business. And sometimes some companies don't think about it, you're absolutely right. They just think, okay, we're just going to find the cheapest thing possible. Some organizations do think about it. They think, okay, we're going to make sure that it's the cheapest thing possible, but we're going to sacrifice the irregularities in other locations. But
so how would a company balance these two needs, this need for standardization of choosing the same steel supplier and all the benefits you get from that, and these small grassroots deferred and delegated solutioning?
it's kind of interesting that you talked about that, because I feel like I've kind of even missed speaking about standardization, which is core to Toyota's model, right? I would give you the short answer by saying you need to just contain it and make sure you have the right communication channels to drive it. The long answer would be that actually what Toyota did that was great was not just give the autonomy for their employees to decide on what the right process is, but they gave them also the opportunity to be able to share those ideas with different manufacturers, different plants, and even with their own suppliers, to make sure that they could share their ideas together, to allow them to then do a root cause analysis as well, to understand whether this is something that could drive standardization across their businesses. And that's where they are right now. They wouldn't be one of the best car manufacturers in the world if each and every plant did something different in a different way, right? They managed to create an environment where communication could be done so well, where respect for people, again, and autonomy could drive standardization so well that they are where they are right now. What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You kind of remind me a little bit of this book I'm still reading. I'm not done with it since last week, of Amazon's application of some of these same principles. And they said one of their key problems was these teams were getting in each other's way. And the way to fix it, they decided, was no more dependencies. Teams should not need each other's help. And that's, I mean, this might only work in a software company, but they didn't have any more coordination. And they basically said, each team, this is what my team does, and here's how you engage my team in a real clear way. And one of the downsides is that now when you use AWS and you use the APIs to connect to AWS, creating an EC2 instance calls a different method than, and it's just the naming convention is different than calling an S3 instance, and it's different than calling a Fargate instance. And if you're a developer, man, it sure would have been nice if they just used the same name for create an instance. You got fargate.create, ec2.create, and s3.create, but they didn't, because they were operating this much deeper philosophy of don't talk to those people, it will mess you up. What do you think of that?
We live in a society.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
that, yes.
Well, yeah. So I definitely, I was smiling because I was like, well, that's called a silo. That's exactly what was bad with the business, and you just applied it in a different way. You actually physically, you created even almost, not only kind of, you almost created like actual silos on your processes completely. You're not allowing transparency. I would call that like a society that completely like isolates itself from everyone else, or like someone that just decides that they're not going to talk to people anymore. And then when they're out in society, like, because that's how it feels like.
Yeah. So the difference, I think, is they do talk to people, but only in public facing documents. So things that can be very easily scaled. 1 million people can read documents just as easily as 4.
Yep.
And so So putting everything that's interesting about your group and how to engage you and what you need and how you work out in front, so anybody can work with it, is I think how they got around that siloing problem. They just really doubled down on excellent documentation. This was a very complimentary book about Amazon. So it may be that there were more hiccups in this siloing process, but it's central to the book that they, instead of managing the dependencies better, they said, we're just gonna avoid the problem entirely. And
I misunderstood it, so don't worry about me.
no, that's what's your response to that? Do you feel like that approach is helpful or broader, or like, does it embody the principles of Toyota and respect and autonomy in its own very weird way?
I think it does from a different cultural perspective, right? So Toyota, when you think about it, focused a lot on, I think that's where respect for people even comes in as an issue, as how you perceive it. Are you respecting people by saying you're part of society? There needs to be that collaboration, and there needs to be that open conversation. And even with excellent documentation, that's not always there. Or would you like to, for example, say, I respect my employees by making sure that they don't get frustrated by other teams. They don't feel the frustrations by everything else. And that's what autonomy means for me. I would say one is very American, funny enough, and one is very Japanese, or very even East Asian in its culture. I would argue, again, I don't know the book. I probably need to read it, as many books, but I would argue that even beyond the silos, what happened is these water cooler conversations that used to drive so much innovation in organizations is missing. It's not about being in the office anymore in this case, right? It's just about driving conversations, having that openness, letting an employee, for example, share their grievances with another employee and drive solutions. The best change kind of projects, interestingly enough, happen through cross-functional teams. And the interesting thing about it is that, let's say that if you have a specific DevOps for this organization, or a specific DevOps for that team, and a specific DevOps for that team, even though you have like everything kind of included or kind of kept into one bubble, the bubble needs to burst every once in a while. And if you're not, from an organizational perspective, allowing that, I don't know if that's a sustainable model.
Yeah, that's a very good point about the water cooler conversations. And I would be curious how they respond. Jeff, if you listen, please let us know and explain the answer. I'd also feel remiss if I didn't mention that even if Amazon did crack this nut in a novel and potentially very efficient and lucrative way, they are still fundamentally adopting this like anti-Toyota approach, because they do have two tiers of employees. They have the thinkers, and all the book is about how to work with the thinker group, the coders and the product teams, and then they have all the people that work on in the distribution centers. I think it might be an interesting question how they think about their suppliers, whether they think of it as extractive, how much can I get out of this supplier, or if they think about it as a partnership. And there might be some spectrum there.
The interesting thing about Amazon too, if you want to think about it from a people development perspective, it's high churn. They bring in thinkers. Yep, they bring in thinkers. Thinkers don't last more than a year and a half, and they created a system where tacit knowledge is contained through the excellent documentation. People come in and people come out, and that's pretty much it. So it is an engine from that perspective. I don't know if it would be anti-Toyota, but it would definitely seem like it's an engine that keeps churning people in and out. So even those thinkers and how to work with them is pretty much how the Industrial Revolution kind of aspect thought about those people who came in, developed, produced 4 widgets, 45 widgets an hour, and then when they couldn't, were kicked out.
So what happens when a company doesn't do at the leadership level? Like maybe you read this book about all these amazing leadership principles of Amazon, and then you see some strong examples of maybe them not following through on it. I know there's a lot of press right now about people not having a lot of trust for Amazon.
There are a lot of brands for that case too.
There are. What do you do with that? And what's the cost of that? How would you build that into a KPI?
So that is a question I think that a lot of leaders, whether in good companies, bad companies, or anywhere, do think about, is how to measure that human element that not only drives long-term results, but at the same time, just like you said, it's kind of muckety muck and kind of hippie talk. And I would say that that's really tough. Going back to the Amazon example, why are people right now so anti-Amazon? It has to do with how Amazon treats their employees and how Amazon is devoid almost in its processes of that respect for people principle of Toyota. What Amazon has done really, really well, and I would give them that, to be honest, to this day, is the red side, or the other kind of pillar of the Toyota system, which is the process improvement pillar. When it comes to automation, when it comes to standardization and everything, they're doing excellent on that. And well, Jeff, if you're listening to me, I know that you stole most of that from Jack Ma. The other side of the principle, though, is the thing that has been missing, and that is creating a PR nightmare for them. I mean, people will work for Amazon because it's the last result, it's kind of their last resort kind of thing. And again, it's because they were just missing that respect of people, respect of autonomy, and respect of everything is. I'll give you an example. The whole thing with peeing in a bottle thing actually was not only sad to read about in the news, but if you were someone measuring output, and measuring the output of a person or an employee, again, by how many boxes they move, post-industrial revolution aspects, and not by what value they might give you beyond that, you're missing the whole point. What Toyota has done really well, again, is be able to say mistakes are part of being human, wanting respect is part of being human, wanting all of that is part of being human. And unlike the last pillar, or the other pillar where you could really measure success, the fuzzy wuzzy pillar of respecting people is just not something that maybe you need to measure, but something that you just need to keep in the back of your mind always as you improve processes. So that's the long answer. Short answer is you don't need to measure something to know that it's really good for you. Just like you don't need to measure success based on trust as well.
Okay. All right. Well, enough about Amazon. Can you give us some examples of organizations or companies that have done this really well, the second pillar of trust and respect and deferred delegation, and it's worked out really well for them?
I would say yes. The interesting thing about it is that, again, maybe these companies are not on the tip of the tongue of people when it comes to successful organizations, but they've managed it really well. And I'll give you one more aspect as well. They've done it cheap. So on one hand, you've got the teal organizations. The teal organizations are things like maybe even Patagonia or Morningstar, where there's so much autonomy in the employees that you could even decide your own bonus. When you decide your own
That's
bonus,
wild.
yeah, imagine that. But then, you're deciding your own bonus, but you're going to have to explain to other people around you why you deserve this bonus. And obviously, this actually is such a trust-based activity, as you can think about it, that it's going to break the organization if there is distrust between employees based on that, and you're going to end up leaving anyways. So I think some of these organizations that decide that you can choose your own bonus, or you can kind of decide your own end year review kind of aspect of it, is that if you have to prove it to yourself, there's a lot of trust that you're going to gain or lose by doing that. Even though I'm a little bit against it because some people undervalue themselves. On the other hand, too, you got Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a great example of trust on the cheap. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they have created an edifice of human knowledge on the backs of people in their basements, just writing things about math and beans and Tamerlan and everything under the sun. I suppose so. It's the ultimate in delegation and grassroots problem solving, isn't it?
It is, because you're really putting a lot of trust into those experts to be able to write all of that down and to do it for free. There's no monetary incentive. Obviously, there are some horror stories that we've kind of seen and everything else like that, but it's people actually regulating themselves. It's groups of people that regulate, again, everything else. I think my favorite horror story is this guy that ended up writing half of or 90% of Wikipedia's Welsh in not a Welsh language.
Yeah,
that was actually pretty fun.
I don't know if it's a different guy, but there was one in Scots.
I think
maybe it's the same story. Anyway,
probably the same example. No, you're good. I probably kind of missed if it was kind of Welsh or a different language. So I do apologize for the speakers of whichever language that guy has offended you on. But Reddit is another one.
Yeah, that is good.
And
tell us more about how that works. Or
I mean, it's really even hard to tell you about how it works, because companies like Facebook try to do it, but they do it really poorly. Reddit somehow managed to get this kind of forum style moderation, let me call it model, in place, and it's done it well. And I think they've done it well because it's usually based on a lot of trust. And funny enough, it's based on less automation too. So, you start a community, the community has mods, those mods know how to manage those communities. They even know how to manage those communities within the Reddit principles. And you don't police them. And they do it really super well. A lot of people that go on Reddit or even interact on Reddit know what Reddit is about, know how to share information, and they share information really well. And they do that through that interesting moderation mod model that is really heavily based on trust.
That's a good point. What about if we're trying to think of more businesses, what would you feel about hold on. I'm going to restart the question.
That's okay.
How would you feel if we were to talk about businesses? The franchise model is often held up as this, like all these Burger Kings are gonna be self-run. But I'm kind of two minds, because very frequently I think, and there have been a couple of cases in the news, the franchise parent is extractive of the franchisees, and they're barely hanging on. And So do you think this is a success, a mixed bag, or mostly a failure
Mixed bag,
from the second
isn't
pillar?
it?
Say?
I mean, I think it's a mixed bag, to be honest, isn't it?
Okay.
Because they're still running.
Mhm.
They're definitely not an Amazon either, where extraction is kind of heavily focused on, interestingly enough, um, really using your employees to the bottom. They still give them enough autonomy to work within that franchise. It's just maybe not enough.
Yeah.
But you tell
Hmm.
me.
I don't know a lot of franchise owners. Maybe we should get some on here, but I'd
That'll
be
be fun.
very curious about different models.
I would be too.
And yeah.
I mean, what do you think about this model? Do you think that the customer is always right model, which you see in a lot of franchise models and you see in a lot of service industry models, is something that is being held to standard even today?
Mm-hmm. Man, I hate that so much. The customer is not always right. In fact, like if you just think about it for a second, it is so wrong. People suck a lot. And so if your customers are occasionally people, there will be plenty of examples when the customer is not right. Now, I think there's an element of truth, and maybe it just didn't ring true in the training modules or something, but
Mhm.
I think saying the customer has value and the customer is worth respect and patience. Those are true things. But right? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Maybe I'm, yeah. What do
no,
you think of that?
it's actually a really good rant. So we can no, really, because we can debate whether the customer post COVID got worse, or whether we've just been away from the customer for so long that we now realize that they're bad. So we can, that is
Right.
a chicken and an egg sort of argument. But I think what's happening nowadays as well is, interestingly enough, a revert back to what trust actually means, or revert back to what respect means. So the Great Resignation is another example too. We're losing trust in our organizations or in our leadership, so we're just resigning and changing. We just can't handle it. Same thing with the customer is always right thing. We're just realizing the customer is not always right. Sometimes they're really rude. And if we want to really maintain trust, really want to maintain our employees' dignity, we need to realize that they can sometimes be wrong, and that for us to respect our customers, everyone else, basically, we need to also respect our employees.
Yeah.
Which is,
I really like you said that, because I think more powerful than the customer is always right, which kind of denies the truth. It's very head in the sand about the customer's frequent wrongness. Is maybe the customer is worth your patience even when they're wrong, or the customer is worthwhile even when they're wrong.
so does the employee as well, as long as boundaries
Yeah,
are,
and the employee is worth your, yeah.
as long as boundaries are not crossed, they could be wrong, as long as the employee has the autonomy to not just say, okay, that's okay, but be able to explain and be able to negotiate and be able to talk about it and be able to not get into fistfights about it, then it's fine, really. This is just people being people. It's fine. And I think this is something that maybe we're just realizing again right now because of the pandemic, but isn't it why people are even resigning? They just had enough of something, and they had enough of being disrespected even, or undervalued.
Yeah, I heard. Well, that was great, Maha. Thank you very much for explaining that second pillar. I think there's more ideas to untangle there, especially talking about the Great Resignation and people's lack of trust in systems and organizations, and maybe how we can rebuild them.
Yep. Let me tell you something, Dylan. When I was studying and researching trust, when I was working in a previous organization, it's a whole can of beans. And I think trust in organizations, trust in the self and everything else, that could be a whole different episode when it comes to organizational excellence too. So thank you, Dylan, for the chat. Thank you for letting me rant about a lot of different things.
Yep.
I definitely learned a lot. And thanks to our listeners for listening to our rants and for continuously supporting us. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback on what we talked about, do let us know in the chat, or do us by leaving us some sort of comments. Don't forget to listen, subscribe, and follow us on any of your favorite platforms. And until next time, see?
That wasn't too
Too
hard.
hard. Oh, we synced a little bit. There we go. Cheers. See you, Dylan.
Bye.
Bye.